Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider series. Today I am so excited to have Daniel Grubbs. He's Chief Venturing Officer at PepsiCo Ventures Group. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you for having me. No, this is tremendous. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Do you mind maybe spending 5 minutes to share your journey into corporate venturing?
Most definitely. I think like with most people in corporate venturing, it's not a straight line. The backstory a little bit is I was in consulting and for years was working with companies that were small, medium, large strategics like PepsiCo, really in the consumer goods space, but also retail space. And it was in those years too, is that the dynamics, and this is kind of going back to the period of 2007 to 2012-ish, where big shifts in the dynamics around consumer goods and how there was a movement towards businesses that were delivering on better for you characteristics, right? Health became a bigger consideration, and naturally smaller companies were more nimble at moving in and basically creating share and creating a position in the marketplace. And one of the things in my consulting background was really working with not just smaller and how they kind of grow and become medium-sized, but also how the medium were starting to identify this and how do they start kind of thinking about potential pivots in their business, or the large on how they defend, right, and kind of their positions. And some of the different actions that each of them were a little bit different. Typically on the large side, it meant acquisition, right? And in other select cases, it was large organizations who were also organized in different ways. It was much more around potentially starting to kick around this idea of how do we operate and play within this ecosystem, but not necessarily to the extent of where the market is today and where companies are today. And it was in that process, actually, I transitioned came into the PepsiCo organization, and came in with a background, obviously, with consulting, but more specifically of really advising and working with companies, not just on the strategy and the growth agenda and innovation, but also very tangible kind of fundamentals around analytics as it related to our industry, category management, a lot of very particular subject matter expertise. So came into a part of the organization that was more on the emerging side of our business. So if you think about PepsiCo, we're a food and beverage organization. But even in that business, we have some large, very established businesses. Whether on the food side, it's Quaker Oats, it's Lay's, it's Doritos, it's our Frito-Lay snack portfolio. On the beverage side, it's big brands that you would be familiar with in carbonated space in terms of Pepsi and Mountain Dew, as well as Gatorade. But what we also had was more emerging businesses, as we would call it. These were businesses that we actually acquired in the prior, give or take, 5-10 years, that were beverages that had more natural characteristics, meaning they came from more natural sources, juices, organic nature of products, things of that sort. So it was, Naked Juice and Izzy and coconut water, and it was basically alternatives to just traditional carbonated soft drinks, if you will. And these were businesses that we were very focused on trying to drive change with, right? And we saw a market opportunity such it led to the acquisition. I came into that group to help basically lead that organization, which we called the Emerging Brands business. Sizable, we had a target to achieve $1 billion, over a certain extended period of time between the whole portfolio. And so it was really driving a lot of the strategy and sort of the development of kind of how we were going to move that business forward. But also leveraging the background previous to coming into PepsiCo, where it was advising and trying to think like the smaller company, right? But trying to do that thinking, considering of a big company.
I see.
So it was that group was really a standalone group within this larger mothership, right? Fully vertically integrated. So we had our plants that were separate from call it the rest of our beverage. We had procurement, we had supply chain, we had our own distribution system, we had our own marketers, we had to deal with our own messaging and ways of going to market with those businesses that were already different than the big business, if you will, right? So there were things that we leveraged from the big, but it was much more around how do we kind of keep going with what this part of the business requires to succeed, which meant not to be different, but more about that there was a consumer, or there was an audience who was interested. So how do we keep serving them? There was demand, and it was, just as an example, we didn't run traditional TV advertising. Why? Because it didn't feel authentic, right, for those businesses, right, to be out there in the same way that you would, say, with a PepsiCo ad, right? We had partnerships that were much more around giving back to the communities, right? Because it's like the products kind of came from the ground and kind of nature of it was, and it wasn't meant to be inauthentic. It was, we just understood where these businesses came from. We were trying to keep that alive, right?
Yeah, authentic.
But leverage these bigger capabilities of this organization that we had, and a lot of that was predicated on if we're growing. And if you're growing, you continue to get more, and you continue to drive that. And so in that process, too, what myself and another colleague or two also started seeing, and what was key here, and kind of getting to the point of kind of the corporate venture side, was I was not sort of baptized within the larger PepsiCo organization in terms of ways of working in that regard. And there was a couple other folks as well who came in from outside. CFO was an actual entrepreneur, right? And he grew up, he worked in large strategics in a time in his life, but he was also an entrepreneur. So he understood the characteristics and natures and the pitfalls of kind of growing.
It's very helpful.
It was very helpful. We had other folks as well who had kind of similar kind of backgrounds working across different sized companies and industries and all that. And so there was a kindred spirit nature. So, but what we saw was there was also a number of new territories that were starting to develop with the consumer, right? And these territories required new sets of capabilities. They required new ways for our business to go to market. It required new ways to speak to the consumer, even beyond the products that we were running and the businesses that we were running. And so, which ultimately led to the idea of that we needed to be active from a venture standpoint. Mm-hmm. But also we needed to push the organization towards potential acquisitions that were continued to be in that spirit, right? Of these businesses that were going to continue to grow share of mind, right? And grow share of wallet with the consumer. So there was sort of a dual path at that point of, well, there's acquisition opportunities and there's also investment opportunities, yep. Right? And in those days, it was very much more centric towards B2C, packaged good, if you will, things that you see and hear and yep. feel, yep. right? A little more straight down the lane. And we started essentially in that unit is getting permission to actually start investing. And but this was before there was a corporate mandate, right? Or ways of doing this. And
it was bottom-up initiative.
It was very bottom-up. And it came from a place, like I was just like this, like the backstory there is a place where we were a business who was very much in spirit with the businesses that we were investing in. And the key thing there, what we really did is say, how do we leverage not just the big organization and the capabilities and the knowledge, but actually what's actually right here within these more emerging businesses. I mean, they were emerging businesses, but still, north of 500 million, right, in collective. So it wasn't necessarily, they weren't small, but they were emerging in the sense of PepsiCo, in that we had a lot of very similar traits and characteristics and knowledge that we could share over to the companies we were investing in, right? So we understood what it meant for them to try to just break into a market, right? Or to expand their business, or try to how to speak, with the consumer and be authentic in that voice, in those ways. But also, and so we could provide advice and counsel kind of across the whole value chain, right? How are you procuring something? How are you making something? How are you distributing something? How are you doing analytics on this business? All those things, and we had it right there. So I was leading sort of the combination of it being in the business and running our business.
Yep.
But on the night time, right? Basically, we would started venturing, and we would spend the time, on that. It was that
two jobs.
It was two jobs really in those, but it was becoming very quickly apparent was the value this was bringing, and where we started seeing some of those businesses starting to mature, right? And so. In addition to that, was starting to push on the ideas that this needed to become a bigger corporate mandate. And so a lot of that turned into, we need to push this up, and we need to spread this, not just to this area of our business and just our beverage business, but we need to expand this to the total organization, right? So not just for North America in beverage or healthier, what we would call healthier natural products and things of that sort, but also to our food side of our business or into potentially other capability areas. And that was about a good year of writing the Constitution, right?
1 year.
One year of writing the Constitution but we had proof points we could look to, right?
Yep.
And writing out the framework and the legal dynamics and the tax and control dynamics, all the fun stuff, right?
Yep.
And serving that up. And it actually had also become a topic and a consideration up to the board level, which was good. So it had actually gone all its way that way, and there was an alignment towards let's drive this as a corporate initiative. And so that was about 7+ years ago, where we were, for the first 2-3 years, we were active doing it, but then it turned into much more of a corporate institution, if you will.
And that was structured as a fund?
No, off the balance sheet.
Off the balance sheet,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So I want to double click on a few things you've said, but one clarification question was the 1 billion. Was it 1 billion revenue or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a magic number, right?
Significant enough to move the needle.
And for that and what I just to clarify, right? It meant those businesses we were already running, and how to essentially we move them from a certain size to in collective kind of that billion, which also became sort of a thing of are there opportunities out in the marketplace for the next $1 billion, right? Business, and where are those to come from potentially? Right, and so there was a little bit of spirit there, but that never became, on the venture side per se, the design to say let's absolutely go find that. But that's naturally something that does occur, right? Which is hopefully these things do get to that level of significance.
So I want to double click on your consultancy background, which comes with a lot of discipline.
Yeah.
What is part of that discipline you find very useful today as you do corporate venturing, you meet with startups, you decide which ones to invest? What discipline do you still use that you find most useful?
I would say that from the consulting days in particular, there's a number of things around. I mean, frameworks are like a big thing, right? Obviously, from a consulting standpoint, frameworks are nice and good, but that's really probably more as it relates to organizing ourselves as a ventures group and how do we think about kind of going after the market. But also from a consulting standpoint around breaking down markets and understanding where it is today, where it can go, right? And what are the critical enablers to kind of achieve those things. And so in understanding kind of that visual roadmap for how a market might evolve will be helpful when we go to talk to companies and kind of understand where they're at on that journey, but also that there's some spaces or companies who we probably know that there's some dynamics in an industry that we would typically do from a consulting and breaking it down and go, here's the enablers that are going to drive action or growth within this industry. And when we go into a space and try to assess it from a venture standpoint, we do the exact same thing, right? Which is what are the enablers in this? And if there's obvious major roadblocks to achieving a level of success, we might identify that early and very quickly write the summary and go, this isn't necessarily a space that is probably worth our time, unless there's a fundamental change to a market. So as an example, if we might think of a new consumer space that we might want to think about our organization moving into. But in the assessment of the space, if it's, you understand how, say, government subsidies work, and that manifests itself in terms of the P&L structure of companies who operate within there and how they have to compete with one another.
Yep.
We know who we are as an organization and what our profit targets are. That might not necessarily be, so we could go through a whole process of investing into that space and kind of getting into the details and all that stuff, but actually at the end, we're probably going to be back where we started, which is actually, I don't think we're going to actually either.
And then you wasted resources on both sides.
Right. And so we spend a lot of that time up front really looking at these new spaces and going fundamentally, like, is there fundamental something here that we can be comfortable with? That doesn't mean everything we go through that process, everything's a no. There's some where it's like, it's an unknown or it's potential if this occurs. Okay, well then that's something let's pressure test. When we get into the individual company conversations, I mean, I would say the consulting background specifically, but also actually being an operator of PepsiCo businesses as well, is kind of understanding going, when we look at P&L and we look at the dynamics of the path and the journey, is understanding, that each of those require different decisions. And so we spend a lot of time right in that diligence process with these companies is really we feel like we understand their business, right? We really try to say, I want to understand the business and the business model. How do you make money? What does it require and take you to achieve this money, right? This business, what are the puts and takes associated with that? What do you have as your capabilities today? What are you going to be doing? And so that consulting background, plus I would think also the time spent being and running a business, right, has been helpful to kind of make that same assessment of kind of early stage, let alone growth stage companies.
And I'm sure it helps you also to identify, like you said, very early, which startups or which market or which space is actually not eventually going to be useful or a growth area.
Yeah, and or the dynamics that are going to be essential for them to scale, right? Or it's going to require a change in, say, a consumer habit, or it's going to require a change in the B2B marketplace, in that regulation occurring or deregulation occurring or something like that. And so that's been critical. The other aspect too is, and this probably pertains more to the companies that are more our B2C lane. We do B2B and B2C, but the B2C is the consulting / analytics background kind of also gets into is that it's hard for us to not, I mean specifically, but also my team who also has similar backgrounds, is we know essentially what it means for a business to look like it's actually on something, it's on a wave, right? By, gathering the right analytics on this business and kind of saying is actually there's really something here.
Yep.
And when we say analytics, it's quantitative sets of analytics, but it's also qualitative and kind of really poring over all potential secondary sources of information versus developing our own primary sources. And so we do a lot of that as well, which is in leveraging my background kind of from experience from research and analytics in the consulting space to kind of say is we gotta look and understand this business from every possible angle, and we should be able to foretell, right, kind of where we think this is going to go.
So there is one thing I find fascinating and hopefully inspiring for the audience is you would think a very big company like PepsiCo, a corporate venturing initiative could only come from the very top, from the CEO. But what you've done is you've started that activity at a smaller scale with a very clear vision of emerging businesses. And then you brought it up to a much more wider view and full corporate, and then got the buy-in, building on top of early successes.
Right.
Can you share the best practices and maybe tips that helped you to do that? Because this is not small company.
No. Yeah, and I'll definitely answer that question. But in that one piece of context, I mean, I always believe is that no corporate is the same, right? Even corporates in the same industry,
Yep.
right, are never the same because it's where's your position in that industry.
Yep.
You know, how much of your balance is towards, let's say, an operating space or category that's in a growth mode versus it's decelerating, or what's the organizational structure? You know, how does decisions get made, right? And so I can speak for who we are and kind of in establishing what we did within there. In some cases, you know, those things are, I think, relatable, right, in other cases to other organizations. But I in speaking with other corporates and stuff like that, every story's
I know,
unique.
but you have an inspiring story.
Yeah, no. So I say that because I really do believe it too. Is that I've had to highly consider who we are, right? What's the culture and what's the DNA and the dynamics, and you know, and for us, you know, the key thing I think for us was working off of a basis of that. We had proof points, right? And I think in anything, it's like if you have something you can point to, you know, and leverage and use, right? It's useful. And it wasn't just that it was, hey, we're doing it, but actually we understand the intricacies of why something works or why something, maybe what we should do to evolve it, right?
Yeah. Well, the learnings are equally important.
100%. And I think that the thing is that there was a push down from the top also to say, actually, should we? And in that process, there was others who said, "Hey, yeah, let's be helpful to kind of assess should there be something." But what was good was that we said, "Look, let us help you. Let's inform you of what this means. Meaning, spend time, a life in art. Come live with us for a bit. Understand it, so that you understand kind of what we're going through. Such the recommendations we're delivering." And then the other key thing became there is that it's like you need a corporate sponsor. You need a sponsor. Right, you need a champion.
Yep.
And we had.
How did you find the champion?
Well, I think we had a few, and I think some of it came because we were serving up some of our initial investments and keeping already those potential champions aware, and we understood the spirit of what we were doing.
That's what I wanted to ask. You didn't find champion. You build champions.
We built champions. And naturally, if you even go back, therefore even back to the start, right, which was, you know, in you can make an argument for our organization. There was 10 years prior to us doing this that was fits and starts, right? Not necessarily of venturing per se, but also of we have small businesses. How do we grow these small businesses within this organization, right? Hey, maybe we should test this model. Maybe we should test this model. So the nature of kind of like test and learn, explore, was always there. Venturing became a new form, but it also came very explicitly off of the back of we were recognizing what the company had been doing in the past. So we weren't trying to ignore it and say, this is the learning based off of who we have been, and this is how we feel this is best suited for who we are, but also we're going to be very pragmatic and say, this is exactly what it is, this is what it, but here's also what it's not, right? And just be very honest. And I think some of the executive sponsors, I mean, appreciated that, but I think recognized it because we kept showing, call it traction or results. And then I think it's, in those situations, it's how much do you ask for, right? And, or go after.
Yes.
And I think it's that you could ask for the whole kit and caboodle, right? Versus you could say is let us keep stretching this and continue to show improve. And I think that was our approach, which let us keep pushing and doing this. Always coming from this space of we recognized who we were as a company, what the value this could potentially bring. Let us keep moving in there. Do you agree? Yes, then let's go in this way. Now we're not going to ask for crazy numbers. We felt like here's the appropriate amount, and we'll continue to show kind of value. Because I always felt too, which was that this is a long road, right?
Walk before you run.
Yeah, and this is this is not going to manifest itself in 6 months, right? Completely. And I knew I was going to be in it for the long road. It's something I love, something I championed, and so it was like, let's set this up. Let's establish this. Let's work with those executive sponsors to kind of also make sure that we're answering the things that they think are important, but that we're not going to take shortcuts, and we're going to stay mission focused, and we're going to continue to try to show results against there, and then one year we'll build upon the next year in that way.
I think you haven't used the word, but what you described is transparency.
Yeah.
You are very transparent. And one thing which maybe there is a tip here for the audience, you talked about inviting them in.
Yep.
Can you share how you did it, for how long, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, and if I think about just the individual companies, say we were investing in at the early stage too, it was having folks from. So this, what's probably important here too, is physically, the location was not at the headquarters. We were actually based outside of the headquarters.
How far away from the headquarters?
Los Angeles versus New York. So
okay, decent.
pretty decent. But one of the things we would try to do in that process is cultivate visits.
Yes.
Right, with those, and it wasn't just to. And I think what's key here is it wasn't just to call it meet the investment companies and the founders and everything associated, but it was also in that time we would share everything else that led up to, say, an individual investment. So meaning, here's our perspective on the market, the space, the characteristics. We'd take them on tours. We would really kind of make sure that they understood is that myself and a couple others, right, who were really kind of driving this was we were fully invested into this world, right? And we lived and we breathed it in not just what we did for our day job, but kind of where also this was going. And then vice versa, we'd bring our startups to the headquarters and do visits in that regard, and help other kind of key constituents kind of feel like they were a part of the process, right? And I think at those early days, it's like you got to have people feel like this isn't some extended thing that's outside of the core, and it's a what always happens, right, in some organizations, oh, this is someone's fun job, or this is over there, this is for a resume or whatever it is. It's like, no, this is, you need to have them feel like they're invested in. And we've maintained that, so therefore then for the last 10 years, which is how I always see it as our group is sort of like conduit to the organization, and how do we get them just as involved in, breathing relationships with our companies, but also the VCs that we meet. So, and the broader ecosystem. And it's how do we don't want to create a wall between us and the rest of the company and this whole ecosystem. It's have them feel like we're a part of it as much as possible.
I really like the word conduit.
Yeah.
It actually implies a lot inside that.
Yeah.
What was the biggest value? I'm sure you had many goals, but what was the biggest value of these visits when it was headquarters, corporate officers, visiting these startups? What was the biggest outcome that came from that?
The biggest, I think, sort of appreciation, awareness, understanding, kind of the individual companies and the capabilities and the technology or what they're trying to solve, but also then what that represents in terms of where the market is going, right? Yes. Because I think, and this happens a lot in corporates, is you're focused on your core business.
Which you have to.
You have to. And naturally, call it 90x% of the organization is focused on that.
Yep.
And you have blinders on, right? As you should too, right?
Like horses, you have to look forward.
You got to do this.
Yeah.
And it's like if you need a part of the organization who's there to say, is look, let's make sure we're also looking outside and keeping aware. And we saw that as sort of the core of what we were trying to do for the organization, right? There's naturally so many things that you could say, keep here, we'll bring you this, we'll bring you that, or keep this attention. But I think that's sort of, it's also harder to measure, right? Naturally, it's harder to read and kind of assess and kind of understand is it delivering on what? And that's still to this day, a big piece of this, which is we want to make aware and understand and appreciation for that market. Because naturally, on the flip side, and this is someone who lived driving a business forward, which was you sell yourself on the products that you're selling and why they are the best and why they should, as you should, but without maybe a full appreciation of, call it, what the next generation could of that product be, or that solution, or your capabilities, right? Naturally, you want to keep driving scale and efficiency in what you're doing, but I think you got to find a balance also in saying is like, we should understand the competitive forces, or we should understand where the innovation's going and how do we adapt this innovation. And so I think as corporate venture capital, right, and an institution within an organization like ourselves, and yourself as well, is there to kind of help the broad organization kind of sense, feel, and understand kind of how to adapt, not just with the strategy they have, but how do they kind of pivot appropriately.
And in a way, this is a trade-off between exploitation of the current business and exploration of new opportunities.
Right.
Today, do you do a mix of that, or are you focused on the exploration side?
Yeah, it's coming today, and I think it's interesting to think about today, and even call it different elements in time over the last, say, 10 years. Is there was periods where there was I would say, more of a balance of exploitation, as you would say, a good mix and exploration. Just as an example, is that we would pressure test and kind of move into some new manufacturing capabilities. Not to say we were ready to go partner or exploit kind of those things and bring them into the business today, but we'll see where those go. Or new category spaces, and we're not really sure how we want to operate within there. And we still do that, but I think there's even more purpose with the business in that exploration. So there was a period of time where it was, let's show the value in that exploration.
Yep.
So therefore, the value of even just exploring.
Yep.
And now we're in the point of, we're going to be very purposeful in the exploration even before we even think of doing it. So the brief associated with the exploration, right?
So how do you create that discipline?
Discipline with the...
knowing what to explore and what not to explore. Because at the end, if you're an explorer, it's about going where the organization hasn't been.
Yeah.
And strategy is about deciding what not to do.
I think for us, I think it's also understanding is like we still have a DNA as a corporation. We still have the backbone of who we are, meaning like we're in the business of delivering on ultimately foods and beverages and enjoyment and taste and exploration, and sips and smiles, as we say.
Yep.
And that could lead to a lot, but it also means we're probably not some things as a core business. And so we don't need to just explore on a number of areas where, and I think being in the organization for a number of years, I have a sense for what those areas are. And then those are also discussions that we have with the investment committee, right? It's around, is this an area that we should? And there's this, sometimes they'll bring it up and I already pretty much know the answer, but in other cases it's like, let's see, should we explore? And actually, I would say for more often than not, we don't go explore unless there's some alignment that there's going to be some value in that exploration, right? So, but I think just back to your question, it's just you kind of have to know who you are. I mean, are we really going to turn into a whole new entity realistically? No, it's probably not. It's probably not worth. It might be interesting to me and to a few others, but that's probably not best use of.
So let me ask you a question which is related. As you build your team, how do you think about the mix of taking people from external who don't have that DNA and people from internal who really understand PepsiCo?
Yeah, and I purposely try to balance those two. There's ideally, and sometimes it might be based on the role, what the role requires. It's probably the roles around governance and around execution and things of that sort, where it's like it's really critical. And I think this goes for our organization is how we operate within our corporate teams and such, it's probably important to have someone who comes from within, right? And understands the dynamics associated. And then there's things that are much more, call it on the investment side that it's probably helpful to have someone who's coming in from the outside and understands maybe, process and call it has already maybe a built-in network and exploration in there. But also, don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of capable folks within our organization, 300,000 plus employees. And it's like, there's a lot of people who are curious at their core, right? Very attention to detail, very personable in terms of building relationships. And that's where it kind of goes back to is we have time here. Meaning if I can give someone internal to say, go out and build a network externally and say, yeah, I mean, like you're probably starting from zero, but I trust that you're going to be able to leverage and kind of build that out in time. In other cases, it's like, hey, this is probably a space or an area that's probably very focused. We want some real good, subject matter expertise, and from an investment principle perspective, it's probably helpful to have someone who's already been doing this and running this in that capacity.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So part of investing in startups is it's sometimes very competitive. You have to move fast.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you invest from balance sheet. How do you work with your investment committee? How did you design the investment committee to have enough speed to be able to move?
100%. Yeah, no, I think we from the start. So and just that story is like moved out of the business to say is look, I'm going to run and design this after writing that constitution, if you will.
I will double click on the constitution.
Yeah. But in there it was where we're at from investment committee. It's small. It's executive focused, so that we can move quick, and we've stayed, even though that there's been a few folks in there who've changed seats and roles and stuff like that. We've been able to execute with high degree of speed and of sort of efficiency when called upon, right?
When it's needed.
When it's needed, but then we do meet on a regular schedule as it relates to updates and back to the point about exploration and territories and alignment, but also what are we seeing in the market?
And transparency.
Transparency, right. So we have those meetings focus on that, but then actually investment decisions happen as needed, in that way. And there's dynamics too around, how important is it to have folks within that investment committee who are, call it, closer to, say, that investment and things of that sort. And I think every organization's a little bit different. I think the way we've solved it is people who are close to that investment are involved, they're aware, they're knowledgeable, they pretty much have alignment, and I want to say buy-in, but buy-in to it. But when it comes to the actual investment itself and the transaction, that's the committee's responsibility and job, ultimately.
Now I need to ask, because
it's
such a big company, when you say it's a small investment committee, how many people?
A handful.
Handful is 5.
Yep.
Okay, good. And do you need a majority for passing, or do you need 5 of them?
It's pretty much a unanimous kind of decision.
So consensus driven.
Yeah.
Now, and here maybe I will challenge or ask a question about this. Sometimes you want to foster a contrarian view, the one where it's not obvious to everyone.
Yeah.
How do you handle the contrarian view being the one that could win?
I mean, I think I would say I'm not out and my team is not out to make sure that it's a yes. So
that's a golden nugget.
We go into it saying, here's the opportunity, and the opportunity relates to a strategic purpose and for everything associated, but it could still lead to a no or to a perspective that's against that, and we're not here to call it push.
You're not pitching.
Yes, in this way. It's more like this is the opportunity, this is the situation. It's obviously been highly assessed, right, through not just our team, but call it the business and the relationship and everything associated. So hopefully by the time we got there, right, now, does it mean that in every possible situation that there's still not debate and consideration? Sure, definitely. And that's naturally our responsibility and my team's responsibility to make sure and assess ahead of time, are we going to run into something of that?
Yep.
Right? And if there is, what is it? And not to say how do we solve it so that it's a yes, just how do we understand it and solve, then therefore what does that maybe mean? Not just about this individual company, but typically that's probably representative of something more macro,
Yes.
right? And so we try to probably maybe make sure that we're appreciating what that macro contrarian viewpoint is, right, versus an individual viewpoint.
Very nice. So now let's go into the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm sure you have chosen that word for a very good reason.
Yes. Well, I think anytime like you have lawyers involved and it turns into a long kind of dynamic and associated with that, it's because you also understand it's like this is something that will hopefully stand the test of time.
Exactly.
Right. And it has, and I think we've, been very purposeful at trying to stick to, the guidelines that we've set out for ourselves. Not try to kind of waver such that we get an individual deal done or whatever it is associated. But also understood is that, like, anytime you start chipping away at that, you're kind of chipping away at the foundation or the bedrock of kind of what you're building.
Yeah, the why.
Yeah, and I think so it's not just like what's the outcomes we're associated, but also of like how are we going to operate, right? And how we how it's going to be the financial considerations, or how are we going to hold investments, and all of those types of things. And don't get me wrong, there's been amendments.
Exactly. That was my next question.
There's been amendments, or even pushing for amendments,
Yeah.
and I think in that process too, like with I think other corporates too, is looking around and going, well, hold on, like industry standard or whatever it might be. But then we understand it's balancing some of those with who we are,
Yes.
right? And what's the risk profile of our organization versus maybe it's not the same for every other corporate. So just as an example, like how you deal with, write downs, or how do you deal with, mark to market, and just different considerations that might be different in every organization slightly, and how you want to what's the tolerance for some of those things. And I think we set out from the start going, okay, we know who we are, and this is probably what it is. Is it worthy of discussion or debate to kind of evolve that over time? We do bring those things up.
That makes sense.
In various scenarios.
Now, you wrote the Constitution.
Yeah.
What is one clause of the Constitution you're the most proud about?
Oh, geez. I would say it's probably something that the I would say it's probably something related to just how we're going to, what we expect in terms of rights with our companies, right? And that I think for the most part we've stayed at the start. We stayed pretty clear on kind of that we don't want to be in a situation as an organization where that we're feel like we're controlling, not just I don't mean controlling the company, I mean more like controlling, call it outcomes and situations. And we feel like we most importantly just want to build relationships.
A good citizen.
Right? And in that if we were pushed to kind of say is that everything has to be from the start, call it that it's our ultimate optionality or outcome, it's like that's not really in the spirit.
Yeah.
But that there's still freedom to kind of say appropriately, and this is more typically is like it. But if we're putting in more, meaning not just capital but partnership, then let's have those things tied to the partnership.
Yes.
Right.
Not to the investment.
Not to the investment.
Very nice.
And I think as much as possible, it's like how do we, because you talk to some other corporates in situations where it's like to your question, it's like from the start, it's that no, it has to be this or nothing type thing.
Then you're forcing the entrepreneurs, which actually is compromising the outcome in the first place.
Yeah. And so I think and I think we knew that because we were already been operating.
Exactly.
And
You already started.
We had already kind of had some a working basis of that.
Very nice.
Yeah.
I think that is reason to be proud, for sure. Now, you talk about partnership. Tell us, and maybe some entrepreneurs will listen to the video, how do you bring value? And what I like about your design is you're very intentional when you go to the investment committee. You have done the work. You know what is the opportunity, which probably means when you invest, you actually have a very clear view about how you're going to add value.
Right. Yeah, and I, on the entrepreneur side, I'm sure it's naturally frustrating at times. Going, when are you going to jump, or when are you going to move? But I think that it's like we don't want to put a term sheet down if we're not really serious, right?
Yeah. But when you do, you're very serious.
Yeah. And I think, and it's also not necessarily that. What we don't do is guarantee on the investment per se levels of commitment from us and our organization to the business outside of normal, board observer relation. And what I mean is, like, we're not here to say you're going to get this every Monday, or you're going to get this level of purse, or this or that, or things of that sort, right? As it relates to the investment, right? What we make clear with them, and also with having them do their testimonials with other past investment portfolio companies, is how we work and what we'll try to do with them from a strategic level, right? And from an insight perspective, from an operational, like meaning, like, how do we kind of help them improve and move from the 1.0 to the 2.0, right? Versions of doing things, let alone skip it and get to the 4.0 without having to do the time, cost, energy of the 3, right? Or actually leaning in together in a much more concrete material way in terms of partnerships, but those might be separate arrangements, right? But that's where it's like we spend that time ahead of going like, where is this going and what is this going to be, and this is how we could probably advise, participate, consult, or call it be a bridge, or back we were talking earlier, a conduit to a business team, right? And even in that process is hopefully, not in all cases, but hopefully also even introduce them before we even start with one of those business teams, so that they already start having a relationship, because there's no reason to wait on this stuff.
No need.
Right? And it doesn't also mean that they're ready to sign something together, but there's no need that the relationship can't start. But also I want our business team to give us their perspective on these things. So, but also that it means is that if we're not fully sold on the space or fully sold on them, that try to be as transparent as possible and say, this is maybe also why we're not ready to move.
Yep.
Right? Does it always get received in the? No, of course. Yep. But some of them do, and I think the transparency goes a long way towards actually them continue to kind of come back to you and not just say, oh, well, you were a no and you'll always be a no. I think if you're, and I've always, and I try to have my team do this too, this is much more about, like, just be a good partner. In that process. Partner. Be a good partner. Advise them, consult them, even before you've invested. If you choose not to do it for whatever reason, doesn't mean you still can't pick up the phone. You can't, have a relationship in those cases and stay close. The number of companies who I still talk to today that we could have invested into 5 years ago, right? And I still have kept that, and actually they've come around, right? And it's just like, just continue to foster and build and maintain those kind of relationships, I think is critical.
Can you talk about the superpower of your CVC? I like to think about CVCs have the advantage of the corporation. Yeah. And that brings superpowers that financial VC cannot have. Yeah. What's your superpower?
I think in our core business, in what we do, and I say what we do, not just in the end product that we make, but in the vertical integration in most regards, is we're very proud, I think, as of the organization in terms of our outcomes and the expertise and the capabilities that we've established and built.
World class.
So as an example, like in our food business, obviously it's we're in good leadership and positions within the categories that we operate, but that also goes back all the way back to the fields, and everything in between in terms of honing that business for, decades. And so, so back to the point, with one of our companies who's developing a unique and different way to manufacture, say, a snack product, our teams are the leading people within a broad industry, either themselves or our partners, our external partners in that, to say, we'll give you a little bit of advice on this, and you're probably not going to find better advice from anywhere, right? And that little thing kind of goes a long way.
Yes.
It goes a long way because it means that those businesses don't have to go through 6 months of making the wrong decision and everything associated with that.
Which is the most costly.
Right. Or in some of our businesses like SodaStream, where it's a business that is, breaking new ground with consumers, but how consumers relate to, call it in-home carbonation and devices and things of that sort. Not to say that there's not other appliances on countertops around the world, but in what we're doing, such businesses that are kind of adjacent to that, like we have subject matter expertise, not just in the manufacturing development, but even in the commercialization and the selling and the dynamics, and how consumers around the world relate to water in different ways. And it's like, those are things that we can share appropriately, with our companies in that process, that they're not going to get it from a research report. If they did it themselves, it's back to the point, it's time cost, but even if they worked with a third party or those trials and things like that, we don't give that away, without for nothing per se, right? Meaning, ideally, it's with our investment partners. But those are things where it's like, we operate in these businesses and we operate vertically integrated, where we understand a lot of those different dynamics, such we can talk about. Now, on the flip side, we're involved with companies where we know nothing. There's nothing in our business that necessarily relates to the core of what, say, this investment.
So it's a real exploration.
Real exploration, right? However, what we typically find is we're still involved for a certain reason, because we felt like that exploration has a tie back to our business. Mm-hmm. And so, as an example, we're involved with a business that's 3D printing in this way, and it's like we can't help them per se with 3D printing, but what we can work with them and help them with is how that relates back their end product and how they're trying to market that, either B2B or B2C, is how that relates back to a part of our business, either in the consumer space or in the functional aspects of what they're trying to do. And there's a part of our business that actually is doing something similar, and we can help them in that capacity.
You could become a customer.
Right, or we could definitely become a customer in those cases. And so I think we're cognizant of who we are and who we have to leverage. And we wouldn't have gotten involved with that company if we didn't feel there was already some sort of degree of partnership, of course, but also that there was what they were ultimately trying to do to drive their business, that we could share with them some things that we had, to contribute to that evolution of their business.
So you clearly are very linked with the business group.
Yeah, we try to be. We try to be.
Very good. Some of the business group probably would see you as an extension to an early M&A roadmap.
100%.
How do you handle this? How do you make sure the right expectations are set, but at the same time you keep your eyes open?
Yeah. No, it's and by the way, I should preface that like for our organization, it's not one size fits all. Meaning, how we're connected in does not mean it's equally, call it, to a certain level.
Very diverse.
It's very diverse, to call it, different pockets of our business. There's some that are call it more established or deeper or whatever you want to say than others, for various reasons. But yeah, I mean, the pre-M&A, and some of our companies might evolve, particularly in the B2C vertical, might evolve to the point of becoming an acquisition. Like we have acquired as an example, right, in that way. And so at the appropriate time, we would kind of hand that over, essentially, though, to the business team to make that assessment themselves, and then our corporate M&A partners to help facilitate, the transaction related to it. And in those cases, and this has happened a number of times as well, where we're not necessarily acquiring, but we go through the process. Is what we're trying to do in there is shepherd that relationship and understanding, so that it's mutually beneficial. Not trying to push it to, if it doesn't transact, that's fine by me. And what I'm interested in is that
it has to be the right
it's been
outcome.
explored, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, just to be honest, it's like timing is everything, right? So the company might want to exit, and it's just not right time on say, the corporate side, and vice versa. The corporate's looking, but it's not right timing with the company. So what we also try to do is say, like, is there ways to kind of hopefully get those things in line, if at all possible. And then there's other situations where, back to the point, is we've built relations with other companies maybe we haven't invested in, but we've maintained those relationships over the years, and they mature to the point, right? And we've been monitoring, keeping track, and so one of the things that we do really is help the business teams kind of know probably what's coming around the bend, but also how to kind of continue to think about that business that's been maturing. We don't know it to the degree that we would be if we were an investor, of course, but
the connection is there.
And relationships are everything, right? And so, yeah, there's a now that doesn't happen for the large M&A transactions that we make. I would just call it's a different process or things, but I would call it more mid-tier, mid-scale stuff. It either can come from us, or it could come from pre-established relationships that kind of mature in that way.
And do you track that?
Track it in terms of like progress,
but also what happens once they have been acquired, and track their progress.
Yeah. Yes, but also at the same time, it's not. We're also not making so many as an organization that there's, call it a.
Very nice. And you alluded to the observer board seat.
Yes.
Which I think is important, not to be a board member when there is a
100%.
potential M&A. I think it's part of your constitution.
Yep. Yeah. No, yeah, we don't want it. I think like most corporates, it's observer works for us. Yep. Obviously, up to a certain equity percentage, then obviously things change or are different. But up until that, observer is fine by us.
Yep.
But also, what we try to do is have sort of the business have a relationship appropriately too, so they're not in the board observer capacity, but that they're still very much frequent relations and such, typically with just the management and the company.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So in the last 2 minutes of our interview, I want to also ask about the future.
Yep.
What are you most excited in the next 12, 20, 18 months to invest in?
Yeah, I mean, for us, sort of the evolution of our beverage business is one that continues to be how consumers are moving increasingly into thinking about sustainable solutions. So really anything that kind of continues to spark innovation in how to deliver beverage, but from what we would characterize as sort of beyond the bottle. So meaning ways to reuse, ways to alternative vehicles to deliver the experience of what a beverage would do. In some cases, that means different ingredient bases. It means different soluble, different solutions. So on the ingredient side, but also in the delivery, right? And so that could also be with B2B organizations who are really pushing the envelope, but trying to figure out more sustainable solutions. And that goes as well on our food side, but particularly in the beverage world, I think there's a big opportunity in consumers' willingness to kind of deliver on refreshment and hydration and functional benefits associated with their beverages that are not just your traditional, call it, single use, vessel, bottle, right, but actually is that there's alternative forms of delivery, and we're very open and interested in that. Tablets and powders and everything associated with that ultimately get to that same sort of experience.
Which is very meaningful.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for your time.
No, thank you.
I think you
This
shared a lot of golden nuggets and insights, and I'm really impressed about such a big organization where you started from one place and made it all the way to the corporate level.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you again. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right.